A cold wind moves across the Mongolian steppe, not as weather in the ordinary sense, but as something older than memory, something that seems to carry the shape of the land itself. It rolls over endless grasslands that stretch without clear beginning or end, broken only by distant ridges and the faint outlines of mountains that look as if they are sinking into the horizon. In this place, distance is not measured in miles or kilometres, but in emptiness. The silence is so complete that even sound feels temporary, as if it has no permission to remain for long. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Long before any empire in the West learns to fear the name of the Mongols, long before cities burn and trade routes fracture across continents, this land is already shaping something unusual in human history. The steppe is not gentle. Winters arrive with a sudden violence that can freeze livestock where they stand, and summers turn the ground into a dry, endless plain where water sources disappear without warning. Survival here is not about control over land. It is about movement, adaptation, and an almost instinctive understanding of change. In such an environment, settled life struggles to take root. There are no great rivers that reliably nourish fields, no forests that offer predictable shelter. Instead, small groups of nomads move with their herds, following patterns that shift with rainfall or grazing conditions and temperature. Life is not built on permanence, but on timing, and in that constant motion, something else begins to form quietly over generations, a culture where mobility is not just survival, but identity. What survives in the archaeological and historical record suggests that the Mongolian steppe has long been home to a succession of nomadic confederations, each rising and dissolving like waves across the grassland. Tribes form alliances, break apart, and reform under new leaders. Power is never fully stable. It is negotiated constantly through loyalty, reputation, and force. Violence is not rare in this environment. It is a language that everyone understands. A tool as natural as a horse or a bow. But beneath this apparent chaos, a pattern slowly emerges. The steppe rewards certain qualities more than others. Speed matters more than strength. Flexibility matters more than fortification. And perhaps most importantly, leadership that can unify scattered groups has an advantage that is almost impossible to challenge once it reaches critical scale. For centuries, larger civilizations beyond the steppe watched these nomadic groups with a mixture of suspicion and dismissal. To the south, in China, powerful dynasties build walls, cities, and administrative systems designed to stabilize human life. To the west, Islamic empires cultivate trade, scholarship, and urban wealth. Even in Eastern Europe, emerging kingdoms define power through land ownership and fortified settlements. In contrast, the steppe appears chaotic, unstructured, and unpredictable. Yet this perception hides a deeper reality. The very instability of the steppe produces something those settled civilizations rarely achieve, a population trained from childhood in survival, horsemanship, and warfare, where every individual is capable of long-distance movement, rapid decision-making, and coordinated violence. Children learn to ride almost as soon as they can walk. Hunting, migration, and conflict blend into a single continuous education. There is no clear boundary between civilian and soldier. And still, for a long time, none of this becomes an empire-threatening force. The steppe remains fragmented. Tribes compete with one another, often more violently than they interact with external powers. Alliances are temporary, loyalty is conditional, and leadership is unstable. It is a world of constant motion without direction. Then, somewhere in the late 12th century, something begins to shift. A figure is born into this unstable environment, not as a king or emperor, but as the son of a minor clan leader whose influence barely extends beyond a small network of families. His early life is shaped by betrayal, exile, and survival in conditions that would destroy most political ambitions before they begin. His original name is Temujin, and at the time of his birth, nothing suggests that he will alter the course of Eurasian history. Yet the steppe has a way of amplifying certain individuals. It does not create greatness in the romantic sense, but it forces adaptation at a scale that reshapes human capability. Temujin grows within a system where trust is rare and alliances are fragile. Every relationship must be maintained through action rather than assumption. Every mistake carries immediate consequences. Historical accounts, though often shaped by later imperial storytelling, agree on one central point: his early life is defined by extreme instability. Rival clans capture and abandon him. His family loses status repeatedly. At one point, he is left effectively isolated in a world where isolation often means death. But instead of disappearing into obscurity, he begins to form a different kind of understanding about power. Power, in the steppe context, is not simply about inheritance or land. It is about the ability to bind people together in a system that survives betrayal. It is about loyalty that can withstand fear, scarcity, and distance. And most importantly, it is about discipline. As Temujin matures, he begins to gather followers, not through simple conquest at first, but through a careful combination of protection, reward, and ruthless enforcement of loyalty. His methods are not entirely unique in steppe politics, but the scale and consistency of their application become unusual. He rewards competence regardless of origin, breaks older tribal hierarchies, and builds loyalty directly to himself rather than to clan structures. This restructuring of social order is subtle at first, but its consequences are profound. Instead of a loose confederation of rival groups, something closer to a centralized command structure begins to emerge. It is not yet an empire, but it is no longer just a tribe among tribes. The steppe, meanwhile, continues its usual cycles of conflict and environmental pressure. Droughts reduce grazing lands. Winters become harsher in certain decades. Competition for resources intensifies. These pressures do not create the Mongol expansion directly, but they sharpen its edge. Every surviving group becomes more efficient, more disciplined, more capable of long-distance warfare. And as Temujin's influence expands, he encounters resistance from established tribal powers. These conflicts are not merely personal or political, they represent competing models of how steppe society should function. Some groups maintain older aristocratic traditions, where leadership is tied to lineage and inherited status. Others begin to adopt more merit-based structures similar to what Temujin is experimenting with. The resulting conflicts are often brutal, but they also serve as testing grounds for new forms of organisation. Each victory strengthens not just military control, but also the idea that loyalty to a single leader can outperform fragmented tribal authority. By the time Temujin is recognised as Genghis Khan, meaning a universal ruler, the transformation is already well underway. The steppe is no longer a collection of competing tribes. It is becoming a unified force under a single command structure, one that can mobilise large numbers of highly mobile warriors across vast distances with unprecedented speed. What makes this moment historically significant is not just the rise of a leader, but the convergence of environmental conditions, social evolution, and military adaptation. The steppe has produced a population uniquely suited for mobile warfare, and now that population is being directed by a centralised authority with a clear strategic vision. Still, at this stage, the surrounding empires do not fully understand what is forming beyond their borders. To them, the steppe remains a distant frontier, a place of occasional raids and border conflicts, but not a source of existential threat. Larger civilizations have faced nomadic incursions before and survived. The assumption is that this cycle will continue as it always has. What they do not yet see is that this is no longer a cycle, it is a transformation. The wind continues to move across the grasslands, as it always has, carrying dust, seed, and silence. But now it also carries something else, the early structure of an empire that will not behave like any that has come before it. An empire that will not settle easily into borders. An empire that will travel faster than the messages sent to warn against it. And as scattered tribes are pulled into a single expanding system of command, the foundation is laid for something that will soon reach far beyond the steppe itself. A force is forming, not yet fully revealed, but already irreversible in its direction. The steppe does not forgive hesitation. It rarely remembers names unless those names are attached to force strong enough to reshape its endless horizon. In the years following Temujin's early consolidation of followers, that force begins to sharpen into something more deliberate, more structured, and far more dangerous than the scattered tribal conflicts that define the region for generations. At first, what emerges is not an empire in any traditional sense. There are no fixed borders, no stone capitals, no written decrees carved into monuments meant to outlast time. Instead, there is movement, rapid, coordinated, and increasingly disciplined movement across a landscape that has always rewarded speed over stability. But now, speed is no longer just survival. It becomes strategy. Temujin's rise into what later sources call Genghis Khan is not a single moment of transformation, but a sequence of violent recalibrations. Each rival tribe defeated is not simply destroyed, but absorbed, reorganized, and redirected, where older steppe confederations would disintegrate after the death of a strong leader. This emerging structure begins to behave differently. It does not dissolve, it expands. Much of what is known about this period comes from later chronicles, often written under Mongol patronage or influenced by imperial memory. These accounts are not neutral, and they often exaggerate inevitability. Yet even when stripped of mythic framing, a consistent pattern remains visible in the historical record, a systematic dismantling of the old tribal order. The traditional Mongolian social structure is built on kinship. Loyalty flows through family lines, clan alliances, and inherited authority. Temujin's approach disrupts this foundation directly. Instead of allowing tribal identity to remain the primary organizing principle, he begins to redistribute loyalty toward himself personally. This shift is subtle in theory, but explosive in practice. It breaks the old logic of steppe politics, where a leader's power is always constrained by the independence of his own kin groups. In place of hereditary privilege, he emphasizes merit, discipline, and loyalty enforced through strict codes of behavior. Individuals who demonstrate skill in battle, logistics, or leadership can rise regardless of origin. Those who fail or betray are not simply removed from power, but often eliminated entirely. This creates a political environment where survival depends less on birth and more on alignment with the central authority. The psychological effect of this restructuring is profound. In a world where alliances were once fluid and reversible, loyalty becomes absolute. The cost of betrayal rises dramatically. At the same time, the reward for competence increases in ways that traditional aristocratic systems rarely allow. This combination produces a new kind of military and administrative elite, bound not by lineage but by shared dependence on the emerging structure. As Temujin's influence grows, so does the scale of conflict. Rival tribes do not surrender this new order easily. Many resist, attempting to preserve older systems of authority. What follows is a series of confrontations that are often described in sources as unusually decisive. Battles on the steppe are typically fluid, with unclear outcomes and rapid dispersal of forces, but under Temujin's evolving system, engagements begin to take on a different character. Units move with coordination that suggests centralized planning rather than fragmented tribal improvisation. One of the most significant developments during this phase is the restructuring of military organization into units based on numerical systems rather than kinship ties. Groups of tens, hundreds, and thousands are formed, each with appointed leaders responsible not to their own clan, but to higher levels of command. This creates a chain of accountability that bypasses traditional tribal fragmentation. Orders can move across the entire force with a consistency previously impossible in steppe warfare. It is difficult to overstate how disruptive this is within the context of Eurasian nomadic politics. Most contemporary societies, whether sedentary empires or nomadic confederations, rely heavily on personal loyalty networks. Temujin's system begins to replace these networks with hierarchical discipline. The result is a force that behaves less like a coalition and more like an integrated machine. But unification does not occur without brutality. The steppe has always been violent, but the scale and consistency of violence during this period begin to exceed previous patterns. Entire tribes are defeated and either absorbed or destroyed. Elite rival leaders are executed or forced into submission. Some are integrated into the new structure, but only after their power bases are dismantled completely. This process generates fear, not just among enemies, but also among newly incorporated groups. Fear becomes a stabilizing mechanism. It reduces the likelihood of rebellion and reinforces the perception that resistance is not merely dangerous, but futile. Over time, this psychological pressure contributes to a broader shift in regional behavior. Tribes that might once have resisted now consider early submission a more rational choice than open conflict. Yet the expansion is not purely driven by terror. There is also a pragmatic logic at work. Under Temujin's system, incorporation often brings stability, protection, and access to larger networks of trade and mobility. In a harsh environment where survival is never guaranteed, the emerging Mongol structure offers a form of order that, while strict, is also functional. This duality fear combined with utility helps explain why the unification progresses as rapidly as it does. Environmental conditions also continue to play a role. Periodic climatic stress, including fluctuations in rainfall and grazing conditions, increases competition across the steppe. In such circumstances, groups that remain fragmented are at a disadvantage. Larger, coordinated forces can move more efficiently between resource zones, protect herds more effectively, and respond to threats with greater speed. The emerging Mongol system, therefore, is not only politically superior but ecologically adaptive. As consolidation accelerates, Temujin's leadership begins to extend beyond purely military matters. Administrative practices develop to manage communication, logistics, and intelligence. Messengers travel across vast distances carrying orders that maintain cohesion across dispersed forces. Information about terrain, enemy movements, and resource availability becomes increasingly centralized. This flow of information is critical. Without it, coordination across such vast spaces would collapse. One lesser-known aspect of this period is the role of captured specialists. Artisans, scribes, and engineers from conquered peoples are often integrated into the Mongol system. While the early Mongol elite is primarily nomadic and non-literate, exposure to sedentary civilizations introduces new capabilities. This exchange does not immediately transform Mongol culture into a bureaucratic state, but it begins to add layers of complexity that will later become essential for imperial governance. Despite this growing sophistication, the core identity of the emerging Mongol force remains rooted in mobility. Horses are not merely transportation, but extensions of military identity. Every warrior is expected to be capable of long-distance travel, rapid deployment, and sustained campaigning without reliance on fixed supply lines. This mobility allows the Mongols to operate across terrain that would severely restrict conventional armies of the time. As unification progresses, the scale of Temujin's authority reaches a threshold where older political categories begin to lose meaning. He is no longer simply a tribal leader among others, nor is he yet an emperor in the traditional sense of sedentary states. Instead, he represents a hybrid form of power that does not fit neatly into existing frameworks. This ambiguity is part of what makes the Mongol rise so difficult for neighbouring civilizations to interpret. To external observers, reports from the steppe begin to shift in tone. What were once accounts of sporadic raids now describe coordinated campaigns involving large, disciplined forces. The unpredictability of earlier nomadic warfare gives way to a pattern that is still difficult to counter, but increasingly recognizable in structure. Yet many established powers still underestimate the significance of what is happening, interpreting it as another temporary consolidation rather than a permanent transformation. Within the steppe itself, however, the transformation is already irreversible. The old order of fragmented tribes governed by shifting alliances no longer defines the region. In its place stands a centralized authority, capable of mobilizing unprecedented numbers of warriors across vast distances, with a level of coordination previously unseen in nomadic history. Temujin's personal authority becomes the binding force of this system. Loyalty is not abstract or symbolic, it is enforced, rewarded, and constantly tested through action. This creates a political culture where stability depends entirely on the continued success and presence of the central leader. It's a system that is both extraordinarily effective and inherently fragile, though that fragility is not yet visible at this stage of expansion. By the end of this phase, the Mongol unification is no longer an emerging possibility, it is an established reality. The steppe, once a fragmented landscape of competing tribes, now functions as a single expanding power base, and from this foundation, outward movement becomes inevitable. What remains unclear to the outside world is not whether this force will expand further, but how far it can go before encountering limits strong enough to contain it. At this moment in history, those limits still appear distant, almost theoretical. The momentum, however, is already in motion, and it carries with it a logic that resists reversal. The steppe has produced many conquerors before, but none quite like this, none who reshape not only territory, but the very structure of how power moves across land. And as the unification completes its violent consolidation, attention begins to turn outward for the first time, beyond the horizon of the grasslands that created it. The first wars of a unified Mongol force do not announce themselves with the kind of dramatic certainty later historians like to impose on them. There is no clear border crossing that marks the beginning of an age of conquest, no singular moment when the steppe suddenly becomes an engine of expansion. Instead, what unfolds is more gradual, more experimental, and in many ways more revealing. Small campaigns begin to extend beyond familiar tribal territory. Probing neighbouring society is the way a hand tests the strength of unfamiliar ice. At this stage, the Mongol system is still adapting to its own scale. Unification under Temujin has created something new, but it is not yet fully refined. The military structure is disciplined, but it is still learning how to operate beyond the environmental logic of the steppe. Early targets are often nearby groups who share similar nomadic traditions or occupy border regions between steppe and settled lands. These are not yet the great empires of China or the Islamic world, but they serve as the first testing ground for what will become a far larger process. What emerges in these early campaigns is a striking consistency speed, coordination, and psychological shock. Mongol forces move with a level of synchronization that is unfamiliar to their opponents. Armies that expect seasonal raiding patterns or fragmented tribal warfare instead encounter something closer to a unified operational system. Communication between units is fast and reliable. Retreats are controlled rather than chaotic. Pursuit is relentless. One of the most important early realizations is that victory does not always require prolonged siege or attritional battle. In many cases, the mere arrival of Mongol forces is enough to destabilize resistance. Reports of their speed often outpace their actual movements, creating a psychological distortion in which enemies believe they are already surrounded before full engagement has even occurred. This perception becomes almost as important as battlefield success itself. At the same time, these early campaigns reveal something else: the Mongol system is highly adaptive. It does not rely on a fixed tactical doctrine in the way many settled armies do. Instead, it absorbs techniques from each new encounter. If an enemy demonstrates effective fortification methods, those methods are studied and later integrated. If a region possesses skilled engineers or siege specialists, they are often spared and incorporated into Mongol operations. This flexibility allows the force to evolve rapidly in ways that static military systems struggle to match. The first major conflicts beyond internal steppe consolidation often involve neighbouring confederations that attempt to resist Mongol expansion through traditional alliances. These groups frequently underestimate the degree of cohesion now present within the Mongol system. Where they expect fragmentation, they encounter unity. Where they expect negotiation, they encounter uncompromising enforcement of authority. The result is a series of rapid collapses that, in hindsight, appear almost inevitable, though at the time they are experienced as shocking disruptions of regional stability. Some groups are absorbed with relatively little destruction, especially when they submit early. Others resist and are dismantled with overwhelming force. The pattern begins to establish a reputation that spreads faster than any physical army resistance is costly. Submission may preserve existence, and delay increases destruction. Yet it would be misleading to interpret these early victories as purely effortless or preordained. The Mongol system is still refining its logistical reach. Operating across unfamiliar terrain introduces new challenges. Water sources are not always predictable. Local intelligence is incomplete, and although mobility is a strength, it also requires constant adaptation to new environmental conditions. Early Mongol commanders must solve these problems in real time, often through trial, error, and rapid adjustment. A key element that begins to distinguish Mongol warfare from earlier steppe conflicts is the integration of long-range coordination. Units can operate independently while still maintaining alignment with broader strategic goals. This allows for multi-directional pressure on enemy territories, disrupting communication and preventing coordinated defense. It is not simply speed that defines Mongol campaigns, but structured dispersion, the ability to spread forces across wide areas without losing coherence. As these tactics develop, neighbouring states begin to respond more seriously. Reports from frontier regions describe not just raids, but organised invasions involving multiple columns of highly mobile cavalry. Defensive responses, however, are often hampered by internal political fragmentation. Many settled states in the region suffer from administrative divisions, rival factions, or ongoing succession disputes. These internal weaknesses become decisive factors when facing an opponent that is externally unified. One particularly significant aspect of this period is the psychological impact on urban populations. Cities, especially those in frontier zones, are not accustomed to threats that can arrive without warning and disappear just as quickly. Traditional siege warfare, while devastating, often follows a predictable rhythm. Mongol campaigns disrupt this expectation entirely. The uncertainty itself becomes destabilizing, trade slows, internal security tensions rise, and political confidence erodes even before direct confrontation occurs. At the same time, Mongol leadership begins to understand the importance of reputation as a strategic tool. Stories of overwhelming force, total destruction of resisting cities, and leniency toward those who submit early spread along trade routes and refugee movements. These narratives are not always uniform or fully accurate, but they serve a functional purpose. They reduce the need for direct military engagement by encouraging preemptive surrender in some cases, effectively turning fear into a force multiplier. This is where the Mongol system begins to demonstrate a form of strategic sophistication that goes beyond simple battlefield superiority. Warfare is no longer confined to direct confrontation. It extends into perception, communication, and psychological influence across regions that have never directly encountered Mongol forces. In some cases, cities surrender based solely on reports from distant neighbours, choosing submission over the risk of uncertain resistance. However, this does not mean that resistance disappears. In regions where leadership is strong or ideological commitment is high, confrontation becomes inevitable. These encounters tend to be more complex, involving fortified positions, coordinated defence, and attempts to exploit Mongol logistical vulnerabilities. It is in these situations that the adaptability of the Mongol system is most clearly tested. One of the most important developments during these early external campaigns is the increasing use of non-Mongol specialists. Engineers from conquered territories are integrated into siege operations. Local knowledge of terrain is utilised to improve mobility and supply routes. This incorporation of external expertise begins to shift the Mongol military from a purely nomadic force into a hybrid system capable of engaging both mobile and fortified opponents. Despite these adaptations, the core advantage remains mobility. Mongol forces can appear in unexpected locations, shift direction rapidly, and sustain operations over large distances without relying on fixed infrastructure. This allows them to bypass traditional defensive expectations. Armies trained to defend cities or hold territorial lines struggle against an opponent that does not operate within those constraints. As the scope of campaigns expands, early encounters begin to reshape regional perceptions of what Mongol power represents. It is no longer seen as a localized steppe phenomenon. Instead, it begins to be interpreted as a broader systemic threat, one that challenges existing assumptions about military organization and political stability across Eurasia. Yet even at this stage, there is still a degree of misunderstanding among distant empires. Many view Mongol expansion as similar to previous nomadic incursions that have periodically troubled frontier regions. The assumption is that, like earlier movements, this force will eventually stabilize, fragment, or be absorbed into existing political structures. What is not yet fully recognized is that the Mongol system has already crossed a threshold that prevents easy reversion to older patterns. The unification under Genghis Khan is not simply a coalition of tribes. It is an evolving structure that integrates discipline, mobility, psychological warfare, and administrative adaptation into a single operational framework. Each campaign strengthens this framework, refining its capabilities and expanding its reach. As these early wars continue, the Mongols begin to transition from testing their system to applying it on a larger scale. The steppe, once the centre of their world, is no longer the limit of their activity. It has become the launching point for something that is beginning to extend into regions far beyond its ecological and cultural origins. And with each successful engagement, the sense of distance between the Mongol world and the surrounding empires begins to shrink. Not physically, but strategically. The illusion of separation is dissolving, replaced by the realization that what was once considered peripheral is now moving toward the centre of Eurasian history. The steppe has always produced violence, but it rarely produces surprise. Raids are expected, border clashes are routine. Entire seasons can pass in the rhythm of horses moving across grassland and smoke rising from temporary encampments. Yet in the early decades of Mongol expansion under Genghis Khan, something begins to shift in the quality of that violence. It is no longer just frequent, it becomes systematic, synchronized, and disturbingly efficient in a way that unsettles even seasoned frontier commanders. As Mongol forces push further beyond the internal steppe conflicts, their encounters with neighbouring peoples begin to expose a pattern that is difficult for outside observers to interpret. At first, many assume they are dealing with another tribal confederation, perhaps larger and better organised than previous ones, but still fundamentally similar in structure. That assumption quickly begins to fail. What defines these early external engagements is not just the outcome, but the speed at which outcomes are reached. In many cases, resistance collapses before full-scale battle even begins. Scouts report formations that appear and vanish with minimal warning. Supply lines of opposing forces are disrupted not through direct confrontation, but through movement that makes those lines irrelevant. The battlefield itself seems to be redefined by motion rather than geography. This is where the Mongol system reveals one of its most important early advantages, the ability to create operational uncertainty. Opponents are rarely able to determine where the main force will strike. Diversions are not separate from strategy, they are integrated into it. Small detachments move in ways that suggest larger forces. Entire regions become saturated with rumours of approaching armies, forcing defensive dispersal even when no direct attack is imminent. In practical terms, this means that many enemies are defeated not in battle, but in preparation for battle. Resources are stretched thin across multiple potential fronts. Communication becomes unreliable as messengers attempt to track a force that does not behave according to predictable routes, and as uncertainty increases, decision-making slows. In warfare, hesitation becomes its own form of defeat. One of the most striking features of this phase is the psychological impact on fortified settlements. Cities, which represent stability and permanence in most civilizations, begin to experience a reversal of their symbolic security. Walls that once represented safety now represent containment. Being inside a city under threat from Mongol forces can become more dangerous than being outside it, as prolonged sieges often lead to starvation, internal disorder, and breakdown of governance. It is during these early external campaigns that the Mongols begin to refine their approach to siege warfare. Even though they originate from a predominantly nomadic background, they do not initially possess the same expertise as long-established sedentary empires in constructing complex siege engines or conducting prolonged urban warfare. However, what they lack in tradition, they compensate for through adaptation. Captured engineers and artisans from conquered regions are increasingly integrated into Mongol operations. These individuals bring knowledge of fortification design, siege technology, and urban logistics. Instead of discarding this expertise, Mongol leadership incorporates it directly into their expanding military system. This decision proves crucial. It transforms what could have been a limitation into an evolving strength. At the same time, Mongol commanders begin to learn that not all cities need to be taken by force. Some can be persuaded to surrender through demonstration of overwhelming capability elsewhere. A city that hears of nearby destruction may choose submission without direct confrontation. This creates a cascading effect across regions, where the fate of one settlement influences the decisions of many others. The use of terror as a strategic instrument becomes increasingly evident during this period, though it is important to understand it not as uncontrolled brutality, but as calculated psychological pressure. Resistance is met with decisive and often devastating force, while submission is frequently rewarded with survival and relative autonomy. This dual approach creates a clear incentive structure that spreads rapidly through affected regions. Still, the expansion is not uniform. Geography, political structure, and internal cohesion of target societies all influence the pace and difficulty of Mongol advances. Some regions resist longer due to strong centralized leadership or difficult terrain. Others collapse quickly due to internal fragmentation or lack of coordinated defense. What emerges is not a single pattern of conquest, but a mosaic of different experiences under the same expanding pressure. In certain frontier zones, local leaders attempt to adapt by forming coalitions against the Mongol threat. These alliances, however, often suffer from the same structural weaknesses that plagued earlier regional politics: mistrust, competing ambitions, and lack of unified command. Against a force that operates with centralized discipline and rapid communication, such coalitions struggle to maintain cohesion. A particularly important development during this phase is the increasing sophistication of Mongol intelligence gathering. Information becomes a critical asset. Scouts are not merely observers, but active participants in shaping operational decisions. They map terrain, track enemy movements, and identify weak points in defensive systems. This flow of information allows Mongol forces to avoid unnecessary confrontation while maximizing strategic advantage. At the same time, the Mongols begin to exploit existing trade routes and communication networks. These networks, originally designed for commerce and diplomacy, become channels for military intelligence. Merchants, refugees, and envoys inadvertently contribute to the spread of information that benefits Mongol planning. In this sense, the infrastructure of Eurasian connectivity begins to work in their favor even before they fully control it. As campaigns extend further outward, the scale of engagement increases, battles become larger, sieges more complex, and political consequences more far-reaching. Yet the underlying structure of Mongol success remains consistent mobility, coordination, adaptability, and psychological pressure. These elements combine to create a system that does not rely on any single advantage, but on the interaction between multiple reinforcing factors. One lesser-known aspect of this period is the internal discipline enforced within Mongol ranks. As the army grows and incorporates more diverse groups, maintaining cohesion becomes increasingly challenging. Strict codes of conduct are enforced to prevent fragmentation, loot distribution, command hierarchy, and punishment systems are carefully regulated. This internal order is essential to sustaining external expansion. Despite their growing power, Mongol forces are not invulnerable. Early campaigns reveal logistical limits, especially when operating far from familiar terrain. Extended campaigns require careful management of resources, particularly horses, which are central to mobility. Environmental conditions such as harsh winters or droughts can significantly affect operational capacity. These constraints force Mongol leadership to remain flexible and responsive, rather than rigidly expansionist. However, what distinguishes this system is its ability to recover and adapt quickly from setbacks. Unlike many sedentary empires, which depend on fixed infrastructure, Mongol mobility allows for strategic withdrawal and rapid redeployment. This means that temporary reverses do not necessarily translate into long-term collapse. Instead, they often lead to recalibration and renewed campaigns with improved planning. As word of Mongol campaigns spreads further into neighbouring regions, a broader transformation begins to take shape in Eurasian political consciousness. The Mongols are no longer perceived as a distant frontier problem. They are increasingly understood as a force capable of reshaping regional power balances. This recognition, however, develops unevenly and often too slowly to prevent initial defeats. By the end of this phase, the Mongol military system has evolved significantly from its early steppe origins. It is no longer simply a mobile nomadic force. It has become a hybrid structure that integrates nomadic mobility, sedentary siege technology, intelligence networks, and psychological warfare into a single coordinated framework. And as this framework continues to refine itself through successive campaigns, it begins to move toward confrontations that will no longer involve minor tribes or frontier states, but the great empires of Eurasia, civilizations with centuries of administrative experience, vast cities, and deeply entrenched political systems. The stage is being set for a far greater collision, one in which the full capacity of the Mongol system will be tested against the most powerful structures of the medieval world. The caravan routes of Central Asia stretch across a world that seems built for continuity rather than disruption. Silk, spices, metalwork, and knowledge move along these arteries in a steady rhythm that connects China to the Islamic world, and further still to the fragmented kingdoms of the West. For centuries, despite wars and shifting borders, these networks remain surprisingly resilient. Empires rise and fall, but trade persists, adapting to new rulers and new demands. Then, in the early 13th century, that rhythm begins to distort. It does not break immediately. At first, merchants notice irregularities, delayed caravans, disrupted markets, and strange reports coming from frontier towns. These reports are inconsistent, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes incomplete, but they share a common element that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. There is a new force moving across the steppe, one that does not behave like previous nomadic groups and does not respect established boundaries between political regions. This force, still in its early phase of external expansion, is already beginning to intersect with the Khwarezm Empire, a powerful and wealthy Islamic state that controls much of Central Asia's urban and commercial infrastructure. On paper, Khwarezm appears strong. It possesses fortified cities, experienced administrators, and access to vast trade wealth. Yet beneath this surface, its political structure is fragile, marked by internal rivalries and tensions between central authority and regional governors. At the same time, Mongol expansion has reached a stage where it can no longer be contained by peripheral responses. What began as steppe consolidation now presses directly against established imperial borders, and unlike previous nomadic incursions, this movement does not dissipate after initial contact. It advances. The first meaningful point of contact between the Mongol system and the Khwarezm Empire is not initially a full-scale invasion. It begins with trade and diplomacy, envoys are sent, caravans are exchanged, and formal messages are delivered between courts. On the surface, this appears to be standard frontier interaction, the kind that has long existed between sedentary empires and nomadic powers, but the situation deteriorates rapidly. Historical sources, though varied in detail, agree on a central sequence of events. A Mongol trade caravan is intercepted in a border city under Khwarezm control. Accusations of espionage are made. Local officials act independently, executing or humiliating members of the caravan. When news of this reaches Mongol leadership, it is interpreted not as a local misunderstanding, but as a direct violation of diplomatic protocol. What follows is a breakdown in communication that becomes irreversible. Attempts at negotiation fail. Envoys sent to resolve the situation are treated with hostility. In the context of steppe politics, where loyalty and reputation are central to authority, this is not a minor incident. It is a challenge to legitimacy. The response that follows is not immediate chaos, but calculated escalation. Before launching a full invasion, Mongol leadership conducts reconnaissance and prepares its forces with unusual precision. This is not a spontaneous raid driven by revenge alone. It is a structured military response directed at a state that, while powerful, is internally divided. Intelligence gathered from merchants, defectors, and scouts reveals a crucial weakness. The Khwarezm Empire is not unified in its response capability. Regional governors operate with significant autonomy, and coordination between cities is inconsistent. This fragmentation becomes decisive. When the Mongol campaign begins, it does not strike as a single massed force against a single target. Instead, it disperses into multiple columns that move with coordinated independence. Cities along the frontier are not approached sequentially in a predictable line. They are approached simultaneously from different directions, disrupting communication between them. The effect is immediate confusion within Khwarezm leadership structures. Messages take time to travel, orders are delayed or intercepted, governors hesitate, unsure whether to commit forces locally or wait for central directives that may never arrive in time. This paralysis is not caused solely by Mongol strength, but by the structural limitations of the empire they are facing. One of the most significant early outcomes of this campaign is the speed at which frontier cities fall or submit. In several cases, resistance collapses with minimal prolonged siege. In others, cities are bypassed entirely after initial submission, allowing Mongol forces to continue deeper into the region without being slowed by extended engagements. This selective pressure creates instability across the entire imperial system. At the same time, the Mongols demonstrate an increasing sophistication in siege warfare. Although originally a nomadic force, they now operate with a growing pool of engineers and technicians drawn from earlier conquests. These specialists contribute knowledge of siege engines, fortifications, and urban assault techniques. The result is a hybrid military system capable of adapting to both open field battles and heavily fortified cities. It is during this phase that the scale of destruction associated with Mongol campaigns begins to intensify in historical memory. Some cities resist and suffer devastating consequences. Others submit and are spared partial destruction. This variation creates a powerful and inconsistent pattern that spreads rapidly through rumour networks. In regions not yet directly affected, fear often precedes actual contact. However, it is important to understand that this is not simply indiscriminate destruction. Mongol strategy is increasingly selective. Resistance tends to provoke harsh outcomes, while early submission can preserve local administration under new authority. This duality reinforces the psychological dimension of warfare, where decisions made before battle often determine survival. Within the Khwarezm Empire itself, internal fractures deepen under pressure. Some leaders advocate coordinated resistance. Others choose to withdraw or negotiate independently. This lack of unified response undermines any attempt to mount a sustained defence. The Mongol system, by contrast, operates with centralised strategic direction and decentralised execution, allowing it to exploit fragmentation with remarkable efficiency. As the campaign advances, entire regions begin to reorganise under the pressure of rapid territorial loss. Trade routes are disrupted, agricultural zones are abandoned, and urban centres face increasing isolation. The economic structure of the empire begins to degrade, not solely due to battlefield defeat, but due to systemic instability triggered by the speed and unpredictability of Mongol operations. One of the more subtle but critical aspects of this phase is the role of information collapse. As cities fall or submit, the flow of reliable intelligence within the empire deteriorates. Leaders are forced to make decisions based on outdated or incomplete reports. In contrast, Mongol commanders benefit from continuously updated reconnaissance. This asymmetry in information becomes a decisive factor in operational success. Despite the apparent momentum of the Mongol advance, the campaign is not without challenges. Operating across vast and unfamiliar territories requires sustained logistical coordination. Seasonal changes, terrain variations, and extended supply distances introduce constraints that must be managed carefully. Mongol commanders address these issues through mobility, rather than fixed infrastructure, maintaining flexibility as a core principle of operation. By the time the initial phase of the Khwarezm campaign unfolds fully, the nature of warfare in the region has fundamentally changed. What was once a frontier conflict between nomadic and sedentary societies has become a large-scale confrontation between a centralised empire and a rapidly expanding, highly adaptive military system. The implications of this shift extend far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Neighbouring regions begin to reassess their own security assumptions. Trade networks adjust routes, political alliances become more fluid, and for the first time, the idea that the steppe could project sustained power deep into established imperial territories becomes not just a possibility, but an unfolding reality. The Mongol system, once shaped entirely by the steppe, is now actively reshaping the world beyond it. And as this transformation accelerates, the scale of what is unfolding begins to surpass anything previously seen in Eurasian history. The walls of Central Asian cities were never meant to be silent witnesses to their own collapse. Built from mud brick, stone, and centuries of accumulated wealth, they stand as symbols of permanence in a world where permanence is always conditional. Yet as Mongol forces move deeper into Khwarezm territory, these walls begin to fail in ways that are not only physical but structural, psychological, and strategic. The first cities to fall do not always fall in the way later history suggests. Some are taken after brief but intense resistance. Others open their gates after recognising that relief will not arrive in time. A few are bypassed entirely, their fate sealed not by direct assault but by isolation. The Mongol approach is not uniform destruction. It is selective pressure applied across a wide system until the system itself begins to collapse under its own weight. What becomes immediately clear during this phase is the speed at which urban confidence erodes. Cities designed around the assumption that time can be used as defence. Walls are meant to delay, towers are meant to observe, and fortified gates are meant to control entry. But Mongol operations disrupt this logic by compressing time itself. The distance between warning and arrival shrinks to the point where preparation becomes almost meaningless. In several recorded cases, reconnaissance forces appear near a city, vanish, and are followed shortly after by the main army arriving from an unexpected direction. This creates a situation in which defenders cannot reliably determine where the true threat lies. Is the visible force the main body, or merely a fragment? Is the real attack imminent, or already underway elsewhere? This uncertainty becomes as damaging as any physical siege. When Mongol forces do commit to direct siege, they do so with increasing sophistication. Early in their expansion, sieges were often simple encirclements combined with intimidation. Now, however, they involve coordinated use of engineers, captured siege specialists, and systematic exploitation of urban weaknesses. Water supplies are targeted, supply routes are disrupted, psychological pressure is maintained continuously, even when no direct assault is occurring. It is during these sieges that the integration of non-Mongol expertise becomes most visible. Engineers from conquered regions contribute knowledge of battering rams, counterweight trebuchets, and defensive weak points in city architecture. This knowledge does not transform Mongol forces into traditional sedentary armies, but it allows them to bridge the gap between mobility and siege capability. The result is a force that can adapt to almost any form of resistance. Yet even with these advances, the Mongol system does not rely solely on engineering or brute force. One of its most effective tools remains psychological disruption. Cities under siege often face internal breakdown long before their walls are physically breached. Food shortages, fear of imminent assault, and rumours of neighbouring cities' destruction contribute to a growing sense of inevitability. In such conditions, internal order begins to erode. Leadership within besieged cities is often forced into impossible decisions. Some attempt prolonged resistance, hoping for relief forces that rarely arrive. Others negotiate surrender terms in the hope of preserving life and infrastructure. But because Mongol responses vary depending on resistance levels and prior behaviour, outcomes are difficult to predict, which only intensifies uncertainty. This unpredictability becomes a strategic asset. In warfare, certainty allows planning, uncertainty forces hesitation, and hesitation, when sustained across multiple cities simultaneously, creates systemic paralysis. At a broader level, the Khwarezm Empire begins to experience what can only be described as administrative fragmentation under pressure. Communication between regions becomes unreliable. Governors act independently, sometimes contradicting central directives. The capital, already under strain, struggles to maintain coherent control over distant provinces. In effect, the empire begins to behave less like a unified state and more like a collection of semi-independent zones reacting individually to external threat. Mongol commanders exploit this condition with deliberate precision. Instead of focusing solely on the capital or larger cities, they apply pressure across multiple points simultaneously. This prevents consolidation of defensive strength. Even when one region organises resistance, others may already be collapsing or submitting, preventing coordinated response. One of the lesser-known but crucial aspects of this campaign is the role of mobility and siege avoidance. Mongol forces are not tied to a single objective. If a city proves too difficult to take immediately, they can redirect attention elsewhere, leaving behind containment forces while the main army continues deeper into the region. This flexibility contrasts sharply with traditional siege warfare, where armies often become fixed in place for extended periods. As a result, entire regions can find themselves psychologically encircled, even when not physically surrounded. The knowledge that Mongol forces can reappear elsewhere at any time creates a constant sense of vulnerability. No city feels securely distant from the front line. At the same time, the Mongols begin to refine their use of intelligence networks within conquered territories. Information from surrendered cities, defectors, and captured officials is systematically collected and analysed. This allows for increasingly precise targeting of subsequent campaigns. Weak points in defence systems are identified in advance. Political divisions are exploited with minimal delay. Despite this growing efficiency, resistance is not entirely absent. Some cities and regional leaders mount determined defences, often motivated by a combination of loyalty, fear of reprisal, and belief in the strength of their fortifications. In these cases, Mongol forces adjust their approach, combining prolonged siege tactics with psychological warfare and strategic isolation. Over time, a pattern becomes visible. Cities that resist strongly and late tend to suffer more severe outcomes, while those that surrender early often retain a degree of autonomy under Mongol oversight. This pattern spreads through rumour and observation, gradually influencing decision-making across the region. It becomes a kind of informal calculus of survival, though never fully reliable. Within this dynamic, the Mongol system demonstrates a key characteristic that distinguishes it from many previous nomadic incursions. It is not inherently destructive in a uniform sense. It is conditional. Its severity is often linked to resistance, not simply presence. This conditionality, however, does not reduce fear. Instead, it amplifies it, because the terms of survival are constantly shifting and never fully guaranteed. As the campaign continues, the economic and social structure of the Khwarezm Empire begins to disintegrate in parallel with its military defences. Trade routes become unsafe or unusable. Agricultural production is disrupted by population displacement and insecurity. Urban centres lose their ability to function as stable administrative hubs. The empire, already weakened by internal divisions, begins to lose coherence at every level simultaneously. What emerges from this phase is not a single dramatic collapse, but a cascading failure across interconnected systems. Military defeat accelerates political fragmentation. Political fragmentation weakens economic stability. Economic instability undermines further military resistance. Each element reinforces the others in a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. And throughout this process, Mongol forces continue to move, adjust, and expand their operational reach with a consistency that prevents any meaningful stabilization of the front. By the time the campaign reaches its deeper stages, it is no longer accurate to describe it as a conventional war between two states. It has become a systemic transformation of an entire region's political and economic landscape. The Khwarezm Empire is not simply being defeated. It is being unstructured in real time, and as its cities fall or submit one after another, the broader world begins to recognize a new reality, taking shape across Eurasia, a form of warfare that does not merely conquer territory, but dissolves the conditions that once made stable empires possible. Fear does not always arrive as panic. In many cases, it begins as something far more subtle, an adjustment in expectation, a quiet recalibration of what people believe is possible. In the regions touched by Mongol campaigns, this shift becomes visible long before armies physically arrive. Trade slows, caravan routes bend away from certain cities. Refugees carry stories that are inconsistent in detail, but consistent in emotional weight. A pattern emerges not from accuracy, but from repetition. What Mongol forces have begun to demonstrate across Khwarezm territory is not simply military dominance, but the strategic use of perception itself. Warfare in this phase is no longer confined to battlefield outcomes. It expands into the psychological space between events, where uncertainty shapes decisions as strongly as direct confrontation. Cities that have not yet been attacked begin to behave as if they are already under siege. Governors issue contradictory orders. merchants delay movement, farmers abandon fields near contested routes. The mere possibility of Mongol arrival begins to alter economic and administrative behaviour across entire regions. This is not the result of formal propaganda in the modern sense, but of accumulated testimony stories passed from survivors, traders, and fleeing officials. At the core of this psychological transformation is a simple but powerful dynamic inconsistency in outcome creates maximum anxiety. Some cities that resist are destroyed, others that surrender are spared, still others are bypassed entirely. Because there is no single predictable pattern. Each decision becomes a high-stakes gamble. In such an environment, rational calculation becomes increasingly difficult. This uncertainty is reinforced by the speed of Mongol movement. Traditional empires rely on distance as a buffer. Information travels slowly, and armies take time to mobilize. But Mongol forces compress this buffer to such an extent that distance loses much of its protective function. A city that believes it has weeks to prepare may instead find itself facing reconnaissance units within days, followed rapidly by coordinated pressure from multiple directions. In this environment, terror is not merely an emotional response, it becomes a strategic byproduct of operational design. One of the most important developments during this phase is the deliberate amplification of reputation. Mongol campaigns generate a growing body of accounts describing overwhelming force, rapid destruction of resisting cities, and severe consequences for prolonged opposition. While these accounts vary in detail and are often exaggerated through transmission, their cumulative effect is consistent. They create a mental map of danger that extends far beyond actual Mongol positions. It is important to note that this reputation is not solely constructed through deliberate messaging. Much of it emerges organically from the movement of people. Refugees fleeing contested zones carry fragmented narratives that spread quickly along trade networks. Merchants adjust routes based on second-hand information. Local leaders make decisions based on incomplete but alarming reports. Over time, these fragments form a shared perception of inevitability. Within Khwarezm territory, this perception begins to erode the cohesion of defensive planning. Central authority struggles to maintain consistent messaging across provinces. Some governors underestimate the threat, assuming earlier reports are exaggerated. Others overreact, abandoning positions prematurely or mobilizing resources inefficiently. The result is a fragmented response that mirrors the political divisions already present within the empire. Mongol commanders, operating within this environment, increasingly treat information as a weapon system. Intelligence is not limited to identifying enemy positions. It is used to shape enemy behavior. A small engagement in one region can influence surrender decisions hundreds of kilometers away. The visibility of destruction becomes as important as the destruction itself. This is particularly evident in the way cities respond differently depending on their proximity to recent events. A settlement near a recently fallen city is far more likely to negotiate surrender quickly than one operating in informational isolation. The Mongols, whether intentionally or through adaptive learning, exploit this gradient of fear with increasing precision. At the same time, internal discipline within Mongol forces ensures that this psychological strategy is reinforced by consistent military execution. Discipline prevents fragmentation of behaviour that could weaken the reliability of their reputation. Orders are carried out with clarity. Punishments for disobedience are strict. Rewards for success are structured and predictable. This internal coherence strengthens external perception. Yet despite the growing effectiveness of psychological warfare, actual combat remains essential. Certain cities and regions continue to resist, often due to strong leadership, geographic advantages, or cultural and political commitment. These resistances provide critical testing grounds for Mongol adaptation. Each fortified city presents new challenges in siege logistics, coordination, and sustained pressure. In response, Mongol forces refine their methods further. Encirclement becomes more precise. Siege operations are supported by improved engineering techniques. Supply disruption strategies are coordinated across wider areas. The integration of siege specialists from conquered territories allows for increasingly sophisticated assaults on fortified positions that would previously have required prolonged traditional sieges. However, even as technical capabilities improve, the psychological dimension remains central. In many cases, cities begin negotiations or surrender discussions not because their defences have been breached, but because they anticipate inevitable breach based on regional patterns. The expectation of outcome becomes as influential as outcome itself. Within Khwarezm leadership, this creates a growing dilemma. To resist is to risk catastrophic destruction. To surrender is to risk loss of autonomy and status. To delay decision-making is to risk both. This triadic pressure produces paralysis in some cases and fragmentation in others. Regional governors act independently, sometimes contradicting each other, further weakening collective resistance. As this fragmentation deepens, Mongol strategy increasingly emphasizes speed of decision rather than sheer force. Rapid movement between targets prevents defensive consolidation. Even when resistance is strong, the inability of neighbouring regions to coordinate effectively ensures that pressure is distributed unevenly, preventing any single point from stabilizing the broader system. Another important factor during this phase is the role of cultural misunderstanding. Settled empires often interpret Mongol behaviour through familiar frameworks of warfare, assuming predictable objectives such as territorial occupation or resource control. However, Mongol operations do not always align with these expectations. In some cases, cities are bypassed entirely. In others, destruction is followed by rapid reorganization under new administrative structures. This inconsistency complicates strategic interpretation. It also contributes to the sense of unpredictability that defines Mongol reputation. When actions cannot be easily categorized, they become more difficult to anticipate, and when anticipation fails, fear expands into uncertainty. Despite this, the Mongol system is not chaotic. Beneath the apparent fluidity lies a structured operational logic centered on mobility, information control, and adaptive response. Each campaign refines this logic further. Lessons learned in one region are applied in another with increasing speed. This creates a cumulative effect, where each engagement improves the effectiveness of subsequent ones. By this stage of the Khwarezm campaign, the transformation of regional power dynamics is already well underway. The empire is no longer responding as a unified entity. It is reacting as a set of fractured components under uneven pressure. Mongol forces, meanwhile, continue to operate with a level of coordination that exploits this fragmentation at every opportunity. What remains most significant is not any single battle or siege, but the way entire systems of governance, communication, and defense begin to lose coherence under sustained pressure. The Mongol advance reveals not only military superiority in specific encounters, but structural vulnerabilities in the way large sedentary empires are organized. And as this realization spreads beyond the immediate conflict zone, it begins to reshape how distant civilizations interpret the nature of warfare itself. The Mongols are no longer just an invading force, they are becoming a test of system stability across an entire continent. Far to the east, beyond the fractured frontiers of Central Asia, the world of northern China is already accustomed to pressure. The Jin dynasty controls vast territories, built upon layers of administration, taxation, and fortified urban centres. It is a system designed for permanence, supported by agricultural abundance and centuries of bureaucratic refinement. To those within its capital cities, the steppe has always been a distant source of irritation rather than existential threat. That assumption begins to erode. At first, reports from the northwest arrive in fragments. They describe conflicts between nomadic confederations, shifting alliances, and occasional raids along border regions. These reports are not unusual. Chinese dynasties have long managed relationships with steppe peoples through a combination of military defense, diplomacy, and economic incentives. The Great Wall system, in its various forms, reflects this long-standing attempt to regulate rather than eliminate northern pressure. But over time, the nature of the reports changes. They begin to describe something more unified, not scattered tribes, but coordinated movements, not seasonal raids, but sustained campaigns, not opportunistic attacks, but structured military operations. The language used by frontier administrators becomes increasingly uncertain, reflecting a growing inability to categorize what they are witnessing. The Jin court, like many large sedentary governments, initially interprets these developments through familiar frameworks. The assumption is that this is another temporary consolidation among steppe groups, one that will eventually fragment under internal pressure, as has happened many times before. This expectation is not irrational. Historically, nomadic confederations have often been unstable over long periods. However, what is emerging under Mongol unification does not follow that pattern. As Mongol forces complete their consolidation in the steppe and deepen their campaigns in Central Asia, the pressure on Jin-controlled territories increases steadily. Border defences begin to experience sustained testing. Fortified positions that were once sufficient against smaller raids now face more coordinated and persistent probing. The scale of engagement increases incrementally, and suddenly, one of the defining characteristics of this phase is the way Mongol forces approach large agrarian empires differently from smaller regional states. Instead of relying solely on direct assault, they begin to combine multiple strategies, rapid mobility, targeted disruption of supply routes, and psychological pressure designed to stretch defensive systems across multiple fronts simultaneously. This creates a situation in which Jin defences, though structurally strong, are forced to respond across an increasingly wide operational space. Fortified cities cannot easily support each other when communication lines are disrupted or delayed. Regional commanders must make independent decisions under conditions of incomplete information. The result is uneven response patterns across the frontier. At the same time, internal issues within the Jin dynasty compound the external pressure. Like many large bureaucratic states, the system depends heavily on hierarchical communication and centralized decision-making. While this structure is effective under stable conditions, it becomes less flexible under rapidly changing threats. Information must pass through multiple administrative layers before action is authorized, slowing response times at precisely the moment when speed becomes critical. Mongol forces, by contrast, operate with decentralized execution under centralized strategic coordination. This allows them to react quickly to opportunities while maintaining overall coherence of campaign objectives. The contrast between these two systems becomes increasingly significant as contact intensifies. Early clashes between Jin forces and Mongol armies reveal a mismatch not only in tactics, but in operational rhythm. Jin armies are accustomed to defending fixed positions, relying on fortified cities, garrisons, and structured supply lines. Mongol forces, however, rarely engage on terms that allow static defense to fully function. They move, probe, withdraw, and reappear in different configurations, forcing defenders to constantly adjust. This creates a form of strategic exhaustion. Even when individual engagements are not decisive, the cumulative effect of constant movement and disruption begins to strain administrative and military resources. Troop deployments must be reassigned repeatedly. Supply routes are adjusted under pressure. Communication networks become overloaded with conflicting reports. In response, Jin leadership attempts to reinforce border defences and consolidate military authority in threatened regions. However, these measures often arrive after conditions have already changed on the ground. The speed of Mongol movement outpaces the administrative cycle of response, creating a persistent lag between threat detection and effective counteraction. Another critical factor during this phase is the Mongol ability to exploit terrain in ways that reduce the effectiveness of conventional defensive systems. Rather than attacking fortified positions directly in all cases, they often maneuver around them, targeting supply routes, agricultural zones, and communication corridors. This indirect pressure weakens the broader system supporting urban defense. Cities that are not directly attacked may still experience significant disruption due to the collapse of surrounding infrastructure. Food shortages, refugee movements, and loss of regional trade connections all contribute to internal instability. Over time, even well-defended urban centres become vulnerable not through breach of walls, but through erosion of systemic support. Within Jin-controlled regions, this leads to a growing sense of unpredictability. Military planners cannot rely on stable front lines. Civil administrators struggle to maintain order in areas where authority is fragmented by distance and disruption. The traditional separation between battlefield and hinterland begins to dissolve. It is during this phase that the Mongol approach to siege warfare becomes increasingly refined. While they are still primarily mobile forces, their growing access to engineers and siege specialists allows them to engage fortified cities more effectively when necessary. Siege operations are no longer improvised but increasingly coordinated with reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and logistical preparation. However, not all cities are approached with the same level of force. Strategic prioritization becomes important. Some locations are bypassed or contained, while others are targeted for decisive engagement. This selective application of force prevents overextension and maintains operational flexibility. As the pressure on Jin territory increases, internal political dynamics also begin to shift. Court debates intensify over how to respond to the northern threat. Some factions advocate for large-scale military mobilization and direct confrontation. Others argue for negotiation, tribute, or strategic withdrawal from contested regions. These divisions slow decision-making at the highest level, further complicating the response. At the same time, information from the frontier becomes increasingly difficult to interpret accurately. Reports are often delayed, incomplete, or contradictory. In some cases, local commanders exaggerate threats in an attempt to secure more resources. In others, they underreport losses to avoid political repercussions. This distortion of information contributes to strategic misalignment between central authority and regional reality. Mongol forces, operating within this environment, benefit from clarity of command and flexibility of action. They are not constrained by long administrative feedback loops. Instead, they adjust continuously based on real-time conditions observed in the field. As contact between Mongol and Jin forces intensifies, it becomes clear that this is not a temporary border conflict. It is a sustained pressure campaign against one of the largest and most established political systems in East Asia. The implications extend beyond military confrontation. They challenge assumptions about how large, centralized states can defend themselves against highly mobile, adaptive forces operating across vast distances. What is unfolding is not simply a series of battles. It is a structural stress test of imperial organization under conditions of rapid and unpredictable warfare. And as this pressure continues to build, the limits of even the most sophisticated sedentary systems begin to reveal themselves in ways that few had previously anticipated. Siege engines are not born in the steppe. They belong to cities, to walls, to civilizations that learned long ago how to defend permanence with engineering rather than movement. Yet as Mongol expansion deepens into China, and across the remnants of Khwarezm influence, a paradox begins to take shape, a mobile people becoming the most adaptable masters of siege warfare in the medieval world. This transformation does not happen through sudden invention. It happens through accumulation. Each city taken, each fortress broken, each engineer captured adds another layer of knowledge into the Mongol military system. What begins as a purely nomadic force gradually absorbs the technical intelligence of sedentary civilizations without abandoning its own foundation of mobility. The key to this evolution is not replacing nomadic warfare, but layering siege capability on top of it. Mongol armies remain fundamentally mobile. Horses, scouting, rapid movement, and dispersed formations continue to define their operational identity, but now they are increasingly supported by structured siege units that can be assembled, deployed, and reconfigured depending on the target. Captured engineers from Khwarezm, Jin frontier cities, and other conquered regions become central to this process. These individuals bring with them knowledge of trebuchets, battering rams, counterweight systems, and urban defensive weak points. Instead of being scattered or eliminated, they are integrated into Mongol command structures. Their expertise is not treated as foreign, but as functional. This pragmatic approach to knowledge acquisition creates an unusual dynamic in medieval warfare. Technologies that once belonged exclusively to fortified empires are now being used by the very forces those empires were designed to resist. The walls of cities begin to face not just brute force, but refined engineering adapted specifically to exploit their structural limitations. In practice, this means that Mongol sieges become increasingly systematic. Reconnaissance identifies weak points in fortifications. Engineers design appropriate siege configurations. Mobile units secure surrounding territory to prevent relief forces. Psychological pressure is maintained simultaneously to weaken internal resistance. The siege becomes a coordinated system rather than a static encirclement. One of the most important developments in this phase is the standardization of siege operations. While each city presents unique architectural challenges, Mongol forces begin to develop reusable methods of approach. This does not eliminate adaptation, but it reduces the time required to transition from reconnaissance to active siege. Speed, once primarily a feature of cavalry movement, now extends into siege preparation. At the same time, Mongol commanders maintain a critical balance between siege warfare and mobility. They do not become fixed in prolonged engagements unless necessary. If a siege becomes too costly or time-consuming, forces may be redirected elsewhere while containment continues. This prevents stagnation and ensures that the broader campaign retains momentum. The psychological dimension remains central even in siege contexts. The presence of advanced siege engines, often built with the assistance of local engineers, has a profound impact on defenders. Walls that once seemed impenetrable now face technology specifically designed to overcome them. The sense of inevitability that begins outside the city gates often intensifies once siege equipment is deployed. Within besieged cities, this creates escalating internal pressure. Leadership must balance the cost of continued resistance against the visible capabilities of the attackers. Food supplies diminish, morale weakens, and uncertainty grows. In some cases, factions within the city begin to advocate surrender independently, leading to internal political fragmentation. It is important to note that Mongol siege warfare is not purely destructive in intent. While some cities experience total devastation due to prolonged resistance, others are incorporated with relatively intact infrastructure. The determining factor is often the duration and intensity of resistance rather than mere opposition itself. This conditional approach reinforces the broader strategic logic of the Mongol system. Compliance is rewarded, resistance is punished. But outcomes are not entirely predetermined. As Mongol forces continue their expansion into Jin territories and deeper into Central Asia, the scale of siege operations increases. Larger cities require more complex coordination, involving multiple siege engines, extended supply management, and sustained operational discipline. This pushes the Mongol system further into hybridization, blending nomadic mobility with elements of sedentary military engineering. Another significant aspect of this evolution is the increasing importance of coordination between different branches of the Mongol military system. Cavalry units, siege engineers, scouts, and logistical support groups must operate in synchronized patterns. This requires communication structures that can function across long distances and shifting battlefield conditions. The development of relay systems and structured command hierarchies becomes essential. Despite these advancements, the Mongols do not abandon their core advantage movement. Even during sieges, mobility remains a strategic asset. Forces can shift rapidly between objectives, respond to emerging threats, or exploit weaknesses in enemy defenses. This dual capability siege power, combined with operational mobility, creates a form of warfare that many contemporary states struggle to understand, let alone counter effectively. Within Jin and neighbouring regions, responses to this evolving threat become increasingly complex. Some military planners attempt to strengthen fortifications further, investing heavily in thicker walls and more elaborate defensive systems. Others advocate for field engagement to prevent sieges from occurring in the first place. Yet both approaches face limitations when confronted with an enemy that can adapt strategy faster than conventional planning cycles. The Mongol system's ability to integrate new technologies also extends beyond siege engines. Logistical innovations, communication methods, and even administrative practices from conquered regions are absorbed when useful. This creates a constantly evolving military apparatus that is not bound by cultural or technological origin, but by functional effectiveness. At the same time, internal discipline ensures that this integration does not lead to fragmentation. The Mongol command structure maintains strict control over how and when new techniques are applied. This prevents the system from becoming overly decentralized or inconsistent across different theaters of operation. As siege warfare becomes more refined, its impact on urban centers deepens. Cities are no longer simply defended spaces. They become nodes in a wider system of pressure, communication, and economic disruption. Even cities that are not directly attacked may find themselves affected by nearby sieges as trade routes collapse and regional stability declines. This interconnected pressure contributes to a broader transformation of Eurasian warfare. The distinction between battlefield and civilian space begins to blur. Military operations increasingly affect economic systems, population movements, and administrative structures. Warfare becomes systemic rather than localized. By this stage of Mongol expansion, siege warfare is no longer an adaptation. It has become a core component of their operational identity. What began as a necessity for engaging fortified cities has evolved into a refined system of engineering, coordination, and psychological pressure. And as this system continues to develop, it prepares the Mongol forces for even larger confrontations, ones that will not be limited to regional powers or frontier states, but to the great dynastic structures that have defined Eurasia for centuries. The steppe has not abandoned mobility, but it has learned how to break stone, and in doing so, it has changed the balance between walls and movement forever. Trade routes rarely announce their collapse with a single dramatic moment. They fade first in small disruptions, delayed caravans, rising costs, altered itineraries until one day the system that once connected continents no longer behaves like a continuous network at all. Under Mongol expansion, this gradual distortion of connectivity across Eurasia begins to accelerate into something far more visible and far more consequential. The Silk Road, in its many branches stretching from China through Central Asia into the Islamic world and beyond, has long functioned as more than an economic system. It is a circulatory structure for goods, ideas, technologies, and people. Cities along its path depend on its stability, empires regulate it, and merchants, regardless of political borders, rely on its predictability. But predictability is precisely what begins to disappear. As Mongol forces expand deeper into Central Asia and pressure the Khwarezm Empire, and as their influence begins to stretch toward northern China, trade routes are no longer simply commercial pathways. They become contested zones of movement. Some regions remain open, others become unstable, and others are effectively cut off entirely due to ongoing military operations. The immediate effect is fragmentation. Caravans that once travelled long, uninterrupted distances are forced to break journeys into segments. Goods are stored, rerouted, or abandoned depending on local conditions. Prices fluctuate not because of scarcity in production, but because of instability in movement. The economic geography of Eurasia begins to shift in response to military geography. Yet what emerges under Mongol dominance is not only destruction of trade, but transformation of it. One of the most significant developments during this phase is the Mongol recognition of the strategic value of controlled connectivity. While early expansion disrupts existing systems, consolidation introduces a different logic. Instead of eliminating trade networks, they are increasingly secured and regulated under Mongol oversight. This shift is gradual and uneven, but its long-term implications are profound. The Mongols understand, through experience rather than abstract theory, that mobility is not limited to armies. Merchants, envoys, and information carriers move through the same spaces. If those spaces are controlled, then not only territory, but communication itself can be influenced. As Mongol authority expands, certain routes become safer under their protection than under fragmented regional control. This is not immediate across all regions, but in areas where Mongol governance stabilizes, merchants begin to prefer routes that fall within their sphere of influence. Security, even under strict authority, becomes more valuable than unpredictability under weak governance. This creates a paradoxical outcome. The same force that disrupts existing trade networks also begins to reconstruct them under new conditions. In Central Asia, cities that survive early Mongol campaigns often find themselves repositioned within a reorganized commercial landscape. Some become administrative centers under Mongol supervision. Others serve as logistical nodes for movement across vast territories. The redistribution of economic importance does not eliminate urban centers, but reshapes their function. At the same time, the role of information becomes increasingly central to both warfare and commerce. Intelligence gathered from merchants and travelers is integrated into Mongol strategic planning. Knowledge of routes, terrain, seasonal conditions, and political stability becomes a resource as valuable as material goods. This integration blurs the line between economic and military systems. Within this evolving environment, the Silk Road begins to function less as a single continuous artery, and more as a network of controlled segments. The continuity that once defined it is replaced by structured zones of influence, interruption, and regulation. In China, the Jin dynasty observes these changes with increasing concern. Reports from Western frontiers describe not only military pressure, but economic disruption. Trade revenues decline in affected regions. Frontier cities experience fluctuating supply conditions. Administrative systems struggle to adapt to the speed of change. Yet internal political divisions within the Jin state complicate any coordinated response. Resources are allocated unevenly, strategic priorities are debated, and as with many large bureaucratic empires, the speed of decision-making does not always match the speed of external threat. Meanwhile, Mongol forces continue to refine their approach to mobility warfare. The same systems that allow rapid military deployment also support the movement of controlled trade and intelligence networks. This dual-use structure strengthens their overall operational reach. Movement becomes both a weapon and a framework for governance. Another important dimension of this transformation is the gradual shift in perception among merchants and local populations. For many, the Mongols are no longer viewed solely as raiders or destroyers. In certain regions, they are increasingly seen as enforcers of order, albeit a strict and centralized one. This perception is not uniform, and it varies significantly depending on local experience, but its existence contributes to the broader complexity of Mongol influence. It is important to emphasize that this is not a peaceful integration in the modern sense. Violence remains a central component of Mongol expansion. Cities that resist are still subject to severe consequences. However, over time, a conditional logic emerges in which stability under Mongol rule can be preferable to instability under fragmented local powers. This does not eliminate fear, but it reshapes calculation. As Mongol authority extends further, administrative practices begin to develop that support the maintenance of long-distance control. Communication systems, courier networks, and standardized procedures for managing movement are gradually introduced in various forms. These systems are not uniform or fully centralized in the early stages, but they contribute to a growing coherence across vast territories. The impact of this transformation on Eurasian connectivity is immense. Regions that were once connected through independent political and commercial systems now find themselves integrated into a new, expansive structure defined by Mongol dominance. This structure is not static. It continues to evolve through ongoing military campaigns, administrative consolidation, and economic adaptation. At the same time, the The disruption of older systems creates lasting consequences. Some trade routes never fully recover their previous patterns. Certain cities decline permanently after repeated cycles of conflict and reorganization. Others rise in importance due to their strategic position within the new system. What is emerging is not simply the collapse of one network and the replacement by another, but a reconfiguration of how long-distance interaction functions across Eurasia. By this stage of expansion, Mongol influence is no longer limited to battlefield outcomes or territorial control. It extends into the very structure of movement itself, who can travel, how they travel, and under what conditions travel becomes possible. This transformation of connectivity becomes one of the defining features of the Mongol impact on Eurasia. It alters not only political boundaries but the underlying systems that connect distant societies. And as this new structure continues to take shape, it prepares the ground for even broader encounters where the Mongol system will no longer interact with fragmented regional powers, but with fully developed imperial states that must now adapt to a fundamentally altered landscape of movement, communication, and control. The steppe, once isolated by geography, is now redefining the geography of the entire continent. And the Silk Road, once a symbol of continuity, becomes a space of negotiation between destruction and reconstruction. On the far western edge of Eurasia, where forests replace steppe and rivers cut through land that feels slow and heavy compared to the open grasslands of the east, news begins to arrive that does not fit existing categories of understanding. At first, it is dismissed as distant disturbance, another wave of steppe raiding, another border conflict between shifting nomadic groups. Europe has heard such stories before, and history has trained its rulers to treat them as temporary. But this time, the rhythm is different. The reports that reach Eastern Europe carry an unfamiliar consistency. They do not describe isolated raiders, but coordinated movements. They do not describe seasonal raids, but sustained campaigns. They do not describe disorganized horsemen, but disciplined formations that move with unusual precision across vast distances. And most importantly, they describe speed movement that collapses the usual expectations of time between warning and arrival. In the courts of Russia's principalities, Hungary, and neighbouring kingdoms, these reports begin to accumulate in fragmented but increasingly alarming patterns. Traders speak of entire regions being emptied of resistance. Refugees describe cities falling with a speed that contradicts traditional siege expectations. Some accounts are exaggerated, others incomplete, but together they form a picture that is difficult to ignore. Yet Europe, like many large civilizations encountering distant threats, interprets these signals through familiar historical memory. The assumption is that this is another iteration of steppe incursions, similar to earlier movements by Pechenegs, Cumans, and other nomadic confederations. These groups have raided, disrupted, and occasionally destabilized frontier regions before eventually fading or being absorbed. What is not immediately understood is that the Mongol system has crossed a structural threshold. It is no longer simply a frontier phenomenon. It is a coordinated imperial force operating at continental scale. As Mongol expansion continues westward through the fragmented territories of the Kipchak steppe, the first direct encounters with European forces begin to occur indirectly, through displaced populations and collapsing border states. The Kipchak Confederation, already under pressure, becomes a transitional zone where older steppe structures break apart under Mongol pressure. Refugees from this region carry the first detailed descriptions of Mongol tactics into Eastern Europe. These descriptions emphasize three recurring features: speed, coordination, and unpredictability. Armies that seem small suddenly appear as multiple converging columns. Retreats are not disorganized, but controlled. Pursuit is relentless, and extended far beyond what European military doctrine considers sustainable. In response, Eastern European states begin to mobilize defenses along traditional lines. Fortified cities are reinforced, feudal levies are assembled, alliances are negotiated between fragmented kingdoms that are often more accustomed to internal rivalry than external coordination. The political structure of the region, decentralized and often internally divided, complicates rapid, unified response. Meanwhile, Mongol forces continue to operate according to principles already refined in Central Asia and northern China. Intelligence gathering precedes major movement. Scouts probe deep into unfamiliar territory. Local political divisions are quickly identified and exploited, rather than confronting unified resistance. Mongol commanders frequently encounter fragmented opposition that can be engaged separately. One of the most significant early European engagements occurs not as a single decisive battle, but as a sequence of encounters that reveal the limitations of conventional medieval warfare against highly mobile cavalry-based systems. European armies, often composed of heavy cavalry and infantry formations designed for direct confrontation, struggle to adapt to an enemy that rarely engages in static combat. Mongol tactics emphasize mobility over direct confrontation when advantageous, using feigned retreats, rapid flanking movements, and coordinated multi-directional pressure. These methods are not new inventions, but their consistent application at scale creates outcomes that European commanders find difficult to anticipate. At the same time, the Mongol system demonstrates an ability to operate across vast distances without losing operational coherence. Communication between dispersed units allows for coordinated action across regions that, in European terms, would normally require centralized command structures and longer planning cycles. This flexibility creates a persistent strategic advantage. As Mongol forces push deeper into Eastern Europe, the psychological impact begins to intensify. Reports of destruction in distant regions circulate faster than reliable information about actual battlefield conditions. This creates a perception of omnipresence, where the exact location of Mongol forces becomes increasingly difficult to determine with confidence. In some cases, settlements choose to flee before direct contact occurs. In others, defensive preparations are made in isolation, without knowledge of broader regional conditions. This fragmentation of response reduces the effectiveness of collective defense. One of the most significant aspects of this phase is the encounter between Mongol operational systems and European feudal military structures. European armies rely heavily on localized loyalty, vassal relationships, and seasonal mobilization. While effective in certain contexts, this system lacks the centralized flexibility needed to respond rapidly across multiple fronts. Mongol forces exploit this structural limitation by maintaining initiative. They dictate the timing, location, and scale of engagements. Even when European forces achieve localized resistance, the broader strategic situation often continues to deteriorate due to simultaneous pressures elsewhere. It is also during this phase that Mongol intelligence networks begin to extend into European territory. Information gathered from captured individuals, defectors, and local sources is used to refine operational planning. Knowledge of terrain, seasonal conditions, and political divisions becomes increasingly detailed over time. Despite growing awareness of the threat, coordination among European states remains limited. Geographic distance, linguistic diversity, and political fragmentation all contribute to slow and uneven response. While some leaders advocate for broader coalitions, others prioritize local defense or internal concerns. The Mongol system, by contrast, does not require political unity among its opponents to maintain operational effectiveness. It relies on exploiting fragmentation rather than overcoming unified resistance. As encounters increase, European observers begin to recognize that they are not dealing with a conventional nomadic raid cycle. The scale, consistency, and coordination of Mongol operations suggest a sustained imperial structure operating with strategic depth far beyond previous steppe incursions. Yet even this recognition develops unevenly. Some regions perceive the threat early and attempt adaptation. Others continue to interpret events through older historical frameworks, assuming eventual dissipation. This uneven perception delays coordinated response at precisely the moment when coordination becomes most necessary. By the end of this phase, Mongol presence in Eastern Europe is no longer theoretical or distant. It is an active force reshaping military planning, political alliances, and regional stability. The frontier between steppe and Europe is no longer a fixed boundary. It has become a shifting zone of interaction, pressure, and uncertainty. And as this zone continues to expand westward, the full implications of Mongol mobility, coordination, and systemic warfare begin to confront some of the most established military traditions of medieval Europe. What had once been a distant rumour has become continental reality. The plains of Eastern Europe do not carry the same emptiness as the Mongolian steppe, yet in certain seasons they begin to resemble it under the pressure of movement armies, refugees, and shifting alliances all converging into landscapes that feel temporarily unanchored. It's here that Mongol expansion collides most visibly with the military traditions of medieval Europe, producing encounters that are neither fully understood at the time nor easily categorized afterward. Two battles in particular come to define this phase of contact, not because they are isolated moments of conflict, but because they reveal structural incompatibilities between two very different systems of warfare. One system is built on heavy cavalry, fortified towns, feudal obligation, and localized command. The other is built on mobility, coordination across distance, intelligence-driven movement, and rapid adaptation. The first of these confrontations occurs near the region of Legnica. European forces, drawn from various regional contingents, assemble under the assumption that a decisive field engagement can stabilize the frontier. Heavy cavalry, long considered the dominant force of European warfare, forms the core of the defensive strategy. The expectation is straightforward once contact is made. Armoured charges will break enemy formations in direct confrontation. But Mongol forces do not behave in accordance with this expectation. Instead of committing to a single frontal engagement, they fragment their presence across the battlefield. Small units probe, withdraw, and re-engage in shifting patterns that prevent the formation of stable European lines. What appears at first to be retreat is in fact controlled repositioning. European forces, trained to pursue and close distance, are drawn into extended movement that disrupts their cohesion. As the engagement develops, the limitations of heavily armoured formations become increasingly visible. While powerful in direct impact, they lack the flexibility to respond quickly to dispersed threats. Communication between units becomes strained. Orders lose clarity under the pressure of rapid movement and changing conditions. The Mongol system, by contrast, maintains coherence through decentralized coordination. Units operate independently but remain aligned through pre-established strategic objectives and rapid communication methods. This allows them to sustain pressure across multiple points simultaneously without collapsing into disorder. The result is not a single moment of European defeat, but a progressive breakdown of organized resistance. Units become isolated, coordination weakens, and over time, battlefield ceases to function as a unified space of engagement. A similar pattern emerges further south near the region of Mohi, where Hungarian forces attempt to establish a defensive position along river terrain. Here, geography is expected to provide natural advantages. Rivers are traditionally used to channel movement, restrict cavalry mobility, and create predictable engagement zones. Initially, this expectation appears justified. Defensive positions are established with the assumption that Mongol forces will be forced into direct confrontation. However, Mongol commanders quickly adapt, identifying weak points in the defensive arrangement and exploiting timing rather than terrain alone. Crossings are executed at multiple points, not concentrated in a single assault. This dispersal prevents the Hungarian forces from concentrating their defensive response. Once again, the key advantage lies not in overwhelming force at a single point, but in distributed pressure across multiple axes. As the battle unfolds, it becomes clear that traditional defensive assumptions are insufficient against an opponent that does not treat terrain as a fixed constraint. Rivers, forests, and open plains are all used dynamically rather than passively. Movement becomes the defining factor rather than position. In both engagements, the outcome reflects not only tactical superiority but systemic mismatch. European military organisation relies heavily on localised command structures and direct engagement doctrines. Mongol forces operate through layered coordination, rapid intelligence integration, and continuous movement. The interaction between these systems produces outcomes that are difficult to reverse once momentum is established. However, it would be inaccurate to interpret these battles as purely one-sided annihilations. In both cases, European forces demonstrate moments of resistance, adaptation, and localised success. These are not trivial, but they are insufficient to alter the broader operational trajectory. The scale and flexibility of Mongol coordination ultimately outweighs isolated tactical advantages. Beyond the battlefield, the psychological impact of these encounters begins to spread rapidly across Eastern Europe. Reports of defeats circulate through fragmented communication networks, often amplified by uncertainty and lack of direct verification. As in earlier phases of Mongol expansion, perception begins to shape reality. The fear of encounter becomes nearly as influential as encounter itself. Political structures within affected regions begin to experience increasing strain. Local leaders face pressure to respond decisively, yet lack consistent information about enemy movements. Alliances are formed, dissolved, and reformed in response to shifting threats. The absence of centralized coordination further complicates defensive planning. At the same time, Mongol forces continue to demonstrate operational flexibility. After major engagements, they do not remain fixed in place unless strategically necessary. Instead, they adjust their movement patterns, probing deeper into surrounding territories or redirecting attention based on intelligence assessments. This prevents the establishment of stable defensive front lines. One of the most significant outcomes of these campaigns is the realization among European observers that traditional assumptions about warfare no longer fully apply. Concepts such as fixed battlefield superiority, linear engagement, and localized defensive strength become less reliable when faced with a system that operates across multiple scales simultaneously. This does not immediately result in strategic adaptation at the continental level. Institutional change in medieval Europe is slow, constrained by political fragmentation and logistical limitations. However, awareness of the scale of the Mongol system begins to influence military thinking in subtle but important ways. Some regions begin experimenting with more flexible defensive arrangements. Others attempt to gather broader coalitions for coordinated response. Yet these efforts remain uneven and often reactive rather than proactive. Meanwhile, the Mongol expansion continues to operate within its established logic mobility, intelligence integration, psychological pressure, and coordinated dispersion of force. Each engagement reinforces these principles while refining their application in increasingly complex environments. By the end of this phase, the Mongol presence in Eastern Europe is no longer an external disturbance. It has become a defining factor in regional political and military planning. Even regions not directly affected by invasion begin to adjust their expectations based on the demonstrated capabilities of Mongol forces. What began as a distant movement across the steppe has now become a structural influence on European strategic reality. And as this influence deepens, the question is no longer whether Mongol forces can be resisted in isolated battles, but whether existing systems of medieval warfare can fully adapt to a form of conflict that operates beyond their traditional boundaries. The answer, at this stage, remains uncertain, but the momentum continues to move westward. After the thunder of Lenica and Moe fades into fragmented memory across Europe, what remains is not stability, but an uneasy pause that feels more like anticipation than relief. Armies withdraw to rebuild, cities reinforce their defences, messengers travel faster than ever, carrying accounts that are inconsistent in detail but consistent in implication. The enemy is not gone, only repositioned. Yet within the Mongol system itself, something begins to change. Expansion, which has defined every stage of its existence so far, starts to encounter the first real constraints that cannot be solved purely through speed or coordination. Distance grows larger not just in geography, but in administrative strain. Communication across vast fronts becomes more complex, and the very success of conquest begins to create new forms of internal pressure. An empire built on movement eventually discovers that movement alone is not enough to hold what it has taken. At its height under Genghis Khan's successors, the Mongol imperial system spans an unprecedented stretch of Eurasia, from the edges of China through Central Asia and into the frontiers of Eastern Europe. No previous political structure has attempted to operate across such a scale with such speed, but scale introduces friction, and friction introduces delay. One of the first signs of internal strain appears in the difficulty of coordinating campaigns across multiple distant theatres. Local commanders, once operating under unified strategic direction, begin to manage increasingly independent operational zones. This is not immediate fragmentation, but a gradual shift in how authority is exercised in practice. The original system relies heavily on personal authority and direct loyalty to the ruling structure. As distances increase, however, the ability to maintain immediate oversight weakens. Decisions that once could be directed centrally now require delegation, and delegation, over time, introduces variation. At the same time, the logistical foundation of Mongol warfare begins to experience natural limits. Horse-based mobility remains extremely effective, but it depends on environmental conditions, grazing availability, and sustained coordination of supply routes across vast distances. Campaigns that once operated within familiar steppe environments now extend into regions with different climates, terrains, and agricultural patterns. This introduces a subtle but important shift. The Mongol system is no longer operating solely within its original ecological advantage. It is projecting power into environments that require adaptation, not just militarily, but administratively and economically. As expansion continues, governing conquered territories becomes increasingly complex. Cities across Central Asia, China, and newly pressured frontier regions require oversight, taxation structures, and stability mechanisms. While the Mongol approach has always incorporated local administrators and specialists, the sheer scale of the empire begins to stretch this model. In some regions, authority is delegated to trusted generals or appointed governors who operate with significant autonomy. This improves responsiveness locally, but reduces uniformity across the broader system. Different regions begin to develop slightly different administrative practices under the same overarching authority. Another emerging tension lies in succession and political legitimacy. The Mongol system, originally unified under Genghis Khan's personal authority, must now navigate the question of continuity. Leadership transition in such a rapidly expanding and decentralized structure introduces uncertainty. Competing claims, regional loyalties, and inherited authority structures begin to intersect in ways that are not always easily resolved. This does not immediately weaken the empire in a visible sense. Military campaigns continue, territorial control is maintained, but beneath the surface, the mechanisms that once ensured seamless coordination begin to require more negotiation, more compromise, and more adaptation. In parallel, the very success of Mongol conquest creates new administrative responsibilities. Large urban centers in China, Central Asia, and Persia are not simply occupied territories. They are economic engines that must be maintained. Agricultural production, taxation, trade regulation, and infrastructure management become essential to sustaining the empire itself. This represents a subtle transformation. A system that began as a highly mobile conquest machine begins to incorporate elements of sedentary governance, not by abandoning mobility, but by layering administrative structures over it. The balance between these two modes, nomadic flexibility and sedentary administration, becomes increasingly delicate. Too much centralization risks slowing the system that made expansion possible. Too much decentralization risks fragmentation across vast distances. At the same time, regional cultures within the empire begin to influence governance practices. Persian administrative expertise, Chinese bureaucratic systems, and Central Asian logistical traditions all contribute to the evolving structure. The Mongol system, rather than replacing these traditions entirely, absorbs and repurposes them where useful. This creates a highly hybridized imperial framework, adaptive, but also complex. On the military side, while large-scale expansion continues, the nature of campaigns begins to shift subtly, from rapid conquest toward consolidation. Fortified regions require longer-term control strategies. Rebellions must be managed rather than simply suppressed. Supply networks must be maintained over longer periods. In some areas, local stability is achieved through a combination of military presence and administrative integration. In others, ongoing resistance necessitates repeated campaigns. The empire is no longer moving across untouched space. It is managing space that is already politically and economically structured. This transition marks an important phase in Mongol history, the shift from pure expansion to imperial maintenance. Even communication systems begin to reflect this change. Relay networks, messengers, and structured routes become more formalized. What began as ad hoc solutions to mobility challenges evolves into more systematic infrastructure supporting imperial governance. However, with all these adaptations, internal divergence slowly increases. Different regions of the empire, shaped by local conditions and inherited administrative practices, begin to develop distinct political identities. The unity that defined the early Mongol expansion becomes harder to sustain without continuous central reinforcement. None of these developments represent immediate collapse. Rather, they reflect the natural transformation of a rapidly expanded system encountering the limits of scale. What was once optimized for speed is now required to balance speed with stability. By the end of this phase, the Mongol Empire is no longer a single, uniform expansion force moving outward from the steppe. It is becoming a layered structure, military, administrative, and regional, each component interacting with the others across vast distances. And as this structure evolves, the question of unity versus fragmentation begins to emerge not as an abstract possibility, but as an increasingly practical concern embedded within the very fabric of imperial governance. The empire has not stopped growing, but it has begun to change what growth means. Empires rarely fracture in a single visible moment. More often, they loosen at the edges first, where distance blurs authority and local conditions begin to shape decisions more than central command. In the Mongol system, stretched across continents and climates, this gradual loosening begins to appear not as collapse, but as divergent small differences in governance, strategy, and identity that slowly accumulate over time. The empire that once moved like a single coordinated force across the steppe and beyond now faces a different reality. Its territories are too vast, its populations too diverse, and its administrative demands too complex to be managed through a single, uninterrupted chain of command. What emerges in response is a necessary adaptation delegation on an unprecedented scale. Regional centres of power begin to solidify. In China, administration increasingly takes on the character of existing bureaucratic traditions. In Persia and Central Asia, governance is shaped by long-established Persian administrative expertise. In the Western regions, military concerns dominate, with frontier conditions requiring constant readiness. Each zone remains connected to the broader imperial framework, but each also begins to operate according to its own internal logic. This is not rebellion, at least not yet. It is structural differentiation. The Mongol system, originally built on personal loyalty and centralized strategic direction, now relies more heavily on networks of trusted leaders operating with significant autonomy. These leaders maintain allegiance to the overarching authority, but the day-to-day reality of governance increasingly reflects local priorities and conditions. As this decentralization deepens, communication becomes more complex. Messages that once traveled across the empire with relative coherence now pass through multiple layers of interpretation. By the time they reach distant regions, they may carry the original intent, but they are increasingly shaped by the intermediaries who transmit them. This introduces subtle but important variations in execution. Military campaigns in one region may differ in tone and method from those in another. Taxation policies, administrative practices, and even approaches to local governance begin to diverge. The empire remains unified in name and ultimate authority, but operationally, it is becoming more plural. One of the key tensions in this phase is the balance between military necessity and administrative stability. Continued control over vast territories requires sustained military presence, but sustaining military presence across such distances strains logistical capacity. At the same time, excessive reliance on local autonomy risks weakening central coherence. This tension does not resolve easily. Instead, it becomes a defining feature of imperial governance. Another layer of complexity arises from succession and legitimacy. As leadership transitions occur within the ruling structure, competing interpretations of authority emerge. Different branches of the ruling elite, each controlling significant regional power bases, begin to assert varying degrees of independence while still acknowledging a shared historical origin. These developments gradually solidify into distinct regional khanates. Each inherits the administrative, military, and cultural frameworks of the original Mongol expansion, but each evolves in response to its own environment and political conditions. In China, the focus shifts toward long-term governance of a densely populated agrarian society, requiring structured bureaucracy and integration with existing institutions. In Persia, administrative sophistication and economic management become central to maintaining stability across diverse urban centres. In the Western regions, military readiness and frontier defence remain dominant concerns due to ongoing external pressures. Despite these differences, a shared legacy persists. The foundational Mongol emphasis on mobility, coordination, and adaptability continues to influence governance structures across all successor regions. Even as fragmentation increases, the imprint of the original system remains visible. Meanwhile, at the edges of the former unified empire, new patterns of interaction emerge. Trade routes that were once controlled through centralized oversight now pass through multiple jurisdictions. Diplomatic relations between successor states become more formalized but also more complex. The interconnectedness of Eurasia does not disappear, it is reconfigured. This reconfiguration produces both stability and tension. On one hand, regional governance allows for more tailored responses to local conditions. On the other, the absence of a single coordinating authority introduces the possibility of conflict between successor entities. Military campaigns during this period reflect this duality. Some operations are conducted in coordination across regions, while others reflect independent strategic interests. The once unified Mongol expansion has transformed into a set of interrelated but distinct political military systems. It is during this phase that the concept of fragmentation becomes historically meaningful, not as sudden collapse, but as gradual differentiation within a previously unified structure. Yet even as political unity disperses, the broader impact of the Mongol system continues to shape Eurasia. Trade networks remain influenced by the infrastructure established during earlier expansion. Administrative practices adopted from conquered regions persist. Military doctrines influenced by Mongol mobility continue to inform regional warfare. In many ways, the empire does not vanish so much as dissolve into the systems it once controlled. This dissolution is not uniform. Some regions retain stronger continuity with the original imperial structure, while others diverge more sharply. The result is a patchwork of successor states, each carrying elements of the original system but adapted to local realities. The steppe itself, once the unified centre of expansion, becomes less of a governing core and more of a symbolic origin point. Its political role diminishes even as its historical influence remains central to the identity of successor elites. What becomes clear in this phase is that the Mongol Empire was never simply a static political entity. It was a dynamic system of expansion, adaptation, and integration. Its fragmentation does not erase its influence. It disperses it across a wider geopolitical landscape. And as these successor structures stabilize, they continue to shape Eurasian history long after the initial wave of conquest has passed. The empire, once unified by movement, now survives through legacy. In the long aftermath of conquest, when borders have shifted and new political structures begin to stabilize, the Mongol impact does not fade so much as settle into the foundations of Eurasia itself. What once moved as a single overwhelming force across steppe, desert, river, and mountain now exists as a dispersed inheritance embedded in administration, trade, military practice, and the fragile memory of survival. The fragmented khanates that emerge from the original imperial structure do not erase what came before. Instead, they preserve different aspects of it. In the east, governance becomes increasingly bureaucratic, absorbing local traditions of statecraft while retaining traces of Mongol administrative discipline. In the Islamic world, Persian models of governance and taxation blend with Mongol military oversight. In the western regions, frontier pressure continues to shape political organization, keeping mobility and readiness central to survival. Across all these regions, one pattern remains consistent: the legacy of speed. The Mongol system permanently alters expectations about how quickly power can move across distance. Even after fragmentation, no major Eurasian state can fully return to older assumptions about time, communication, and military response. Distance has been redefined not as protection, but as a variable that can be compressed. Trade networks, once disrupted and then reconfigured under Mongol influence, continue to operate within this new reality. Caravans move through corridors shaped by earlier campaigns. Cities that survived or were rebuilt become nodes in a restructured continental system. Goods, ideas, and technologies circulate more broadly than before, even if under different political conditions. The Silk Road, in its transformed state, reflects both disruption and integration. Military systems across Eurasia also retain the imprint of Mongol methods. Mobility, reconnaissance, psychological pressure, and coordinated multi-front operations become part of the strategic vocabulary of later states. Even those who once resisted Mongol expansion eventually absorb elements of its military logic, adapting them to their own contexts. Yet perhaps the most lasting transformation is not material, but conceptual. The Mongol expansion forces Eurasian civilizations to reconsider the relationship between nomadic and sedentary worlds. The steppe is no longer seen as a distant periphery, but as a central actor in shaping continental history. The distinction between civilized center and nomadic frontier becomes less stable, more interdependent, and historically intertwined. At the same time, the memory of destruction remains deeply embedded in historical consciousness. Cities that fell, dynasties that fractured, and regions that were reshaped carry lasting marks in both written records and cultural narratives. The Mongol period becomes a reference point for scale used to measure later crises, invasions, and political transformations. Over time, the fear that once accompanied Mongol expansion softens into something more complex, a mixture of respect, caution, and historical reflection. The empire is no longer an active threat, but its structural consequences remain embedded in the systems that replaced it. In examining its rise and fragmentation, what becomes clear is that the Mongol Empire was not simply a story of destruction or conquest. It was a moment of accelerated connectivity and restructuring across Eurasia, driven by a system that combined mobility, adaptability, and centralized coordination in ways that no previous empire had achieved at such scale. Its strength lay not only in battlefield success, but in its ability to reorganize the conditions under which empires functioned, how they communicate, how they defend themselves, and how they manage space over vast distances. And even as the unified structure dissolved, those changes did not reverse. They remained, embedded in trade routes that continued to evolve, in administrative systems that carried forward adapted practices, in military doctrines that learned from its methods, and in the geography of Eurasia itself, which had been permanently reinterpreted through movement. The Mongols did not simply conquer land, they altered the logic of distance. And in the quiet after centuries of movement, what remains is not the sound of hooves across the steppe, but the long echo of a system that once made the vastness of a continent feel briefly connected under a single, shifting horizon.